Hey everyone, it's Hurley from Inklips. Welcome to another video. Today I'm over at the Newton's Nook vlog and I'm super excited to share a no-line watercolor technique using their awesome little hedgehog hollow stamp set. And I'm also going to be using a variety of different watercolors and a water-soluble ink so we can create our own no-line looks with these awesome stamps. For all three of the cards today, I chose some of my favorite watercolors to show you, and I'm going to be using them throughout the video and kind of explaining how they work with this technique and what kind of effects you'll get. So I hope you guys will try out whatever watercolors you have and see what you can create with that as well. I'm using this Color Theory ink because it's a water-based ink, so it will react with the water later on and the lines will kind of disappear. And it's also a super light color, and I find the light tans disappear and work with this as well. So I'm inking it up, and then I'm going to grab a piece of scrap cardstock and stamp this down off to the side, which will give you the first generation stamped image, which is really dark. And then I'm going on to my actual piece of cardstock we're using for the card, and I'm stamping it down kind of in the lower right hand corner, and you'll see what we do with that later. But I'm just stamping that down, and so it will be twice as light of a color as the regular ink is. So after that stamps down, you can barely just see it there, and that will give us that no line look, and some of those lines will actually disappear as we're watercoloring since we chose a water soluble ink. So I'm going to just stamp the rest of these images down onto the cardstock, again focusing down into the right because we're going to be cutting these out later on. And you're also going to want to make sure you have a nice even coverage overall throughout the stamp. That way you won't be able to see any splotchiness in the lines as you color later on. For the first card, I'm going to be using this Zig Clean Color Real brush pens. If you guys are not new to my channel, you've seen me use these a bunch in the past, and I love these especially for this technique because they give super vibrant and deep colors, and also they're in that little paintbrush tip so you can get into some really fine details, which really helps a lot when you're doing this technique to get all those little details in the stamp. Now, one thing you really want to remember and make sure you do while coloring in these images is make sure you kind of go around the edges and make sure that the darkness or where you want the shadow in the image is nice and dark, and that you go all the way around the lines. Sometimes when you're coloring in regular images, you can go lighter in some areas and darker in the others. You're not going to want too much variation in these images because the person who's looking at the image has nothing to really go off of since there's no actual lines. So you're going to want to make sure you kind of make it as easy as possible by filling in most of the space that you're coloring in with some pretty dark lines, but you can go a little bit lighter here and there to show some variation. So then I'm just going in the darkest areas with the darkest color that we're using, which would be kind of right around the head where the head and the spikes meet. And then I'm doing it kind of to the side of the cup so that has a little shadow and makes it look round. And then I'm coloring it all in like this, just using my little water brush to smooth it out. Now I am using Bristol cardstock today just for this piece. This is super nice to blend these markers together. It has a little bit of coating on top, and it's the best paper I found that works with these markers in particular, or really any water-based markers that work. It just blends like butter, and it just gives you that little bit of extra time you need. So then for this little head piece, again, I want some nice variation because the arms and the head will kind of look like they're connecting if you don't give it some nice shadows there. So I'm adding in some darker color and some shadows around the edges to make sure that you know where the different arms are as opposed to from the head. If you guys know what I'm saying at all here, you really just want to make sure that you kind of add those lines in yourself without making them too dark or, drawing in the lines. So it kind of makes it look like you watercolored this all by yourself when in reality you used your little stamp there. I added in the eyes with a little pen, and then I'm going to go over the bottom and I'm going to just add this little gray shadow on the bottom by scribbling a little bit on and then watering the whole thing out. None of your scribbles have to be super neat because everything is going to be watered out in the end. So now I'm moving on to this card using the Peerless watercolors. Now these are a little bit different, but I still love the bright, vibrant effects you get in the end. These actually come on sheets like this, and you kind of just lift out the sheet and pull the color off, and they're super highly pigmented there, so a little bit goes a long way with these. Once again, I'm going with the darkest area right kind of where the head meets the spikes. That way it gives that nice variation from those two spots and you can tell the difference. And then I'm just going around the edge and I kind of smooth out the edges of the hedgehog because it's kind of hard to get all that detail in with that little brush there. So you can kind of add and change the stamp as well because you're not going to be seeing most of the lines in the end anyway. So I'm also going in with a little bit of reddish orangish color there, and in between all these layers I'm drying the colors so I have nice dark, crisp lines so that nothing really bleeds together when I'm changing the colors. I forgot to mention that earlier, but I do dry in between every single layer that I do. So then I'm just adding some depth and dimension on the top of his head to vary out that, and then I'm moving into this little ladybug here, adding some little shadows on there, but since this little ladybug is so simple, I'm just doing some red and then the gray on the head to fill the whole thing in and kind of make it look like a little ladybug there. And I do go in with some pen and add little pen details for the antenna and the eyes and everything like that. Then I'm adding a little grounding place like I did on the other one, except here I'm going in with some super bright colors like the yellow and the green at the bottom, just for some difference from the other pieces and to show you guys a different way you can kind of do it. Instead of adding those darker grays, you can add some really nice bright colors on the bottom to make everything pop out. So I'm using some greens and lighter colors here, and I can match this with papers and cardstocks later on my card. So then on the last and final card that we're doing here today, I'm using the Gansai Tambi watercolors. This was one of my first watercolor sets, and I still love how smooth the colors go on and how great of an effect it gives you in the end. Now I would call these kind of semi-transparent because you can add them on really dark, and then you can also kind of make them transparent by kind of watering the colors out so you can kind of make your own little decisions here. And I'm just doing, once again, kind of going around the edges with the darker colors to make sure you fill in those nice lines. And then I'm doing the little mushroom here and making the part where the hedgehog is sitting on a little bit darker than the rest to give some shadows there and some lines. And then I'm also going around those little dots to make it really dark, and then I'm going to add some grays in there as well. Once again, making sure to dry in between every single layer to make sure nothing will bleed together later on. I'm doing the same thing that I've done with the hedgehog. All this time, I'm just adding some darker colors from the head transitioning into its little spikes here. And I just love these hedgehog images to do with this technique because they're so simple and flowy to do, and there's not too much detail you have to catch in on in order for people to kind of understand what the actual image is. But you guys can try your hand at whatever you want to. I think this image or technique is so much fun, and you could do it with so many varieties of different stamps and images you guys have. So I filled the eyes and nose in with the pen marks. I feel like that's just kind of a necessity to do. And then I'm going to just add a little grounding place with some green colors there as well. You'll notice that all the watercolors look different, and I think they all give their own different effects and bright colors to this. So then I'm going on and stamping down the sentiments. Now I left this part in just because I wanted to show you some parts of my creative process, and in case if you wanted to stamp it flat down onto the card, I think that looks awesome. But I was using a new Ultra New ink pad here, and when ink pads are new, they're mostly like really inky, and so I didn't remember that, and I started moving these cards around and kept creating with them as I usually would, and I accidentally smudged a lot of the ink on some of these, so I decided to just go in and restamp the image later, and you'll see kind of how I remedied that and kind of fixed it later on. But I just wanted to show you guys you can stamp it right down onto the cardstock and it looks great as well. For this next part, I didn't actually have any measurements for this, so I kind of apologize, but I'm just adding all the different images that we created on some funky angles and things like that. That's why we didn't stamp it completely centered on our cards, and you could do some measurements here, but I actually had a different card that I did the same thing with to test out this technique, and so I'm just adding it into my card base, sliding the card out from underneath and cutting it right at an angle. You can also do this with your cards and just line it up with the card base on where you want it to be and then cut it down like that. I really don't have any recommendations on any measurements or anything. You could just freehand it as well. So after I've done that, I'm going to mat my images down onto some bright colors of cardstocks. I cut the layers of a bunch of different other papers here that we created, and I'm doing them all at some fun and funky angles, which I think just adds a lot to the cards, and you can kind of create a whole scene like that and add some dimension with the layering papers and the different angles you can cut it at. So I'm just cutting the last piece here at a little bit of an angle on the bottom of the cardstock, and that will finish off my cutting. So after I've done that, I'm going to remedy those sentiments by just stamping down the sentiment again and cutting it out. This really helps my case because then I can just add it right down onto the sentiments that we fixed earlier, and we won't have to ruin any of our watercoloring or anything like that. So after I've added that down, I think it just adds a little bit of dimension there as well, and then we can add these onto our cards with some foam tape to add some more dimension, and you'll notice I added those little borders of colored layering paper. Now I actually did end up cutting a little bit off these cards on the sides because they weren't the correct proportions. I actually cut down the pieces that I watercolored on a little bit too small, so they aren't perfectly A2 sized, but you know, they're around there. So this is a card I created with colored pencils. It's just another way you guys can do this technique, which I think is awesome as well. But I love the flowy technique we got with these watercolors today, and all the different variations and shades of colors and different effects you get with the different watercolors you have. And I encourage you guys to try out whatever you guys might have at home. I hope you guys enjoyed this video as much as I loved creating it. If you did, please give it a big thumbs up, and if you want to see more of my work, check out inkclips.com. I'll have it linked somewhere on screen here, but the blog post is actually over at Newton's Nook Designs, so I'll leave a link down below where you guys can check out that post for this video with much more information, a supplies list, and lots of pictures and stuff. If you want to see more of my videos, there's some linked on screen here, and I hope to see you very soon back here again. Thanks so much for stopping by, and have a great day.